So this class is called Curves and Levels, or Levels and Curves, depending on how you like to say it. And when I discussed with the powers that be the topic here, I said, you know, to be honest with you, I don't really use curves as much as I used to, or levels for that matter, because of things like Lightroom and Camera Raw. So we're going to talk about levels and curves, but we're also going to talk, and by we I mean, you know, me, I'm going to talk about levels and curves and where Camera Raw fits into the picture. I mean, certainly you could do it in Lightroom as well, but Camera Raw happens to have a nice connection directly to Photoshop. So the answer that most people, or excuse me, the question most people ask is, which one should I use? And the answer really is, it depends. It depends on which one you like, what you're comfortable with, what you're trying to achieve, and what kind of level of control you want. Levels is probably the one most people start with because it's very capable, but it's a little easier to understand. And curves is a little more challenging, and Camera Raw, part of the reason it's my favorite is because there's more options, all of which are very intuitive. So if you're one of those people that's completely brand new to Photoshop and making adjustments, Camera Raw is actually a really great place to start because it's probably the most intuitive of any of the methods to make adjustments. The bottom line is there's nothing wrong with using any of them. So there's no wrong answer to say, well, I'm using levels, should I not be? That's perfectly fine. So you'll hear different opinions. People say, we should use curves. Well, no, you should use whatever you feel comfortable with and what gives you the result that you want. The one thing I would say is, regardless of which choice you make, levels or curves, there's no question in my mind that one thing that doesn't change is you should not be accessing them from this menu here. And if you've seen any of my other sessions, is not news to you. Because the worry I have when you use these adjustments under here is you're making a permanent adjustment that you may not be able to change your mind later or keep working on it. And I always want the opportunity to go back and revisit something where at the moment that I made that adjustment, it might have made perfect sense, but now that I've done 20 more steps, I might want to go back and say, maybe I made it a little too dark, and I'd like that opportunity to go backwards. The problem with all of these is as soon as you make an adjustment and click OK, that's now the new image. Now, of course, you could undo it right away, or what some people do is they duplicate the background layer and work on a copy, which is, it's better, but it still means you just end up with a layer that you can't go back and change. So for example, if I save this right now, and I didn't have any other copy of this image, that's my new photograph. And I might love it at this moment in time, but later on if I think, oh, I wish I had, well, it's kind of late now. Could you potentially recover it? Maybe. With a lot of effort, it just doesn't work very well. So the more that you do this, and I'm going to keep doing bad things that you wouldn't normally do just to make a point, if I keep going to levels and I'm just pressing the keyboard shortcut Command or Control L to get to levels, that histogram that you see ideally should be a nice little hill in the middle. And the lower it gets, or then eventually you'll see spread out little lines, that means you've done so much damage that there really is no going back. And the only way of going back in this case would be I can revert to the way it was when I first started. But again, if I close and save this, I'm done. So I don't want to take that chance. I don't want to ever feel like I've painted myself into a corner that I can't get out of. And as I talked about in one of my other classes on I guess it was called Break Bad Habits, but it was really about having good habits. One of them is work non-destructively because it gives you many, many benefits, not the least of which is being able to go back later and change your mind or refine your work or repurpose it. So you've done an adjustment layer on one image, you want to use it on another one, you can. So you have a couple of choices here. I, as a habit, because we are creatures of habit, I still go down to this bottom menu, which is where all the adjustment layers live. There also is a separate one, which I have to even find where it is because I don't use it, but I guess because I didn't have it showing. So here there's little icons that are the same as going down to that pop-up menu. So you'll see me going down to this menu. I could also use these. I will say one nice change. Every so often Adobe makes a change, which is a real help. When this one first came out, see how when I'm hovering over each icon, the name changes? In the first version, it didn't do that. So you just kind of go, V, what's that for? Or this one, oh, it's a crown. Oh wait, no, it's levels. So now at least there's little things so you know which one they are. But again, I don't tend to use those just out of habit, but you certainly could. So when you do add an adjustment layer, here's what happens. I have my layers panel set up so that as soon as I add an adjustment layer, the properties panel appears immediately above it. And that way I can see at the bottom what I'm doing is adding an adjustment layer right above my background layer, but then right above that is my levels adjustment layer. And just to compare the difference, if I went back to the one under this menu, Adjustments and Levels, you'll see it's a much bigger dialog box that even if you try and move it as far as you can, there's a good chance you're still going to cover up part of your image. So the reason I don't like using this anymore, two reasons. One is it's just kind of obtrusive and gets in the way and it's annoying, but more importantly, as I saw a moment ago, as soon as I clicked OK, I'm making a decision that I have to pretty much live with. And that, to me, is just a dangerous road to go down. So I'd much rather use this approach. It's exactly the same dialog box, just smaller and off to the side. So you know you'll always see your entire image, and this applies to any adjustment layer, not just levels. It'll always show up in this Properties panel and give you all the controls, but the difference is when I make that over adjustment, there's no OK button for me to say, make this permanent. It just means really that you're leaving it this way. So if I collapse the Properties panel, it looks like if you just look at the image, it looks like I've made a significant change, but in the Layers panel, you're still seeing background image, adjustment layer. So that means I can turn it on or off to compare the difference, and I can double click on it to remind myself what settings did I use. And you'll see how it didn't redraw the histogram, it just said this is where you left the sliders. Okay, so that's why across the board, anything we talk about, we're going to use adjustment layers versus things under the image adjustment menu, whether it's levels or curves in this discussion or any other adjustment layer. The only exceptions to that would be, for example, if I scanned in an old photo I was going to restore and it just was something wrong with it and I knew I was never going to even remotely have a chance of reverting back to the original image. In a case like that, frankly, I might use levels right on the image itself. But even though I say that, I probably wouldn't. I probably would still use an adjustment layer just because that little voice in my head is like, oh, do you really want to do that? So the good news about these adjustment layers is you can add multiples of the same one. So if you wanted to do levels for the sky and then levels for the grass and levels for the tree, you could do that by combining the adjustment layer itself and the mask that comes with it. We'll talk about that as we go along here, but just to give you an idea here, I'm going to throw this away for 1 second just to make a comparison. Previous to adjustment layers, if I wanted to adjust only the grass, as an example, what I would have had to do is take some selection tool and select that area, and then when I press the shortcut for levels, which is decided, see, it doesn't even want me to do it because it's saying, no, you can't do it because of a program error. It's just because it's really telling you shouldn't really do it that way. But if I could get it to work, you would see that it would only adjust that one area, and that's how people used to do it. Now what we do instead is I can still make that selection and use a levels adjustment layer. And now, as you'll see, when I start to make the adjustment, see how it's only affecting the bottom area? That's because when you start with a selection, it automatically turns that selection into a mask that tells it only adjust this particular area. So this way, I could now say, well, you know what? Now that I've done that, let's do this. Make it into a selection, and let me clarify what I did there. So when I'd made my selection, I added the adjustment layer, which created the layer mask. As soon as you have a layer mask in Photoshop, that really is a selection shown in a different way. So if I want to reselect the same area, I hold down the Command or Control key and click on the layer mask, and it loads it as a selection. Now, if I choose Select Inverse, it's going to select the opposite area, so now I could add a different second levels adjustment for that area and make whatever kind of adjustment I wanted there. So that's quite common, is to look and see that, well, you've got two levels adjustment layers. Why would you do that? Because I'm adjusting two different areas. Because sometimes you look at a photograph and you do say, yes, overall, I just need to adjust this image because it's pretty close to what I want. But I find quite often you also then look a little deeper and go, I'd love to do some selective editing where just this row of trees here, I'd like to have a little more detail in the midtones or whatever it might be. So if you think in that manner of being able to add multiple adjustment layers and then determining which area that adjustment layer is affecting by making a selection and or mask, that means, I guess the alternative way of looking at it is compared to the alternative, which is trying to do it in one shot, where it'd be almost impossible. Because the adjustment layer is going to, by nature, affect the entire layer. So if you're trying to affect the sky and the grass differently, how is that even possible with one adjustment layer? It isn't. It would adjust the global photograph. So some photographs you will be able to adjust globally. Others you have to do this kind of thing, and we'll look at some other examples as we go. For now, I'm going to just go back without anything selected, delete the layer mask, and make an adjustment. So with levels, the way that we work with it, there's a couple of different options. The reason many people like levels is because it gives you feedback, and that's the histogram. When you open curves the first time, all you get is a diagonal line, and as one of my colleagues used to say, it's almost like, I dare you, start moving things around and see what happens, because it's like there's no indication of what you should do other than you kind of knowing where should I move a curve, whereas the histogram, when I open a histogram that looks like this, and I see this big gap right here, that tells me there's no pixels in this photograph that are as dark as they probably should be. Now, you may decide aesthetically that you're okay with that, but ideally, every photograph should have a nice black point and white point and midtone in it, and that's what these three triangles and the numbers equate to, is that. So if you ever open a photograph and it has a big gap at either or both ends, one of the simplest things to do is just move that triangle in so you start to get almost where the bulk of it starts. You see, I had to move that in quite far, but if I turn that on or off, you can see it's already made a fairly significant difference, because now I've said I have a little more contrast there. In this case, I don't have to do anything at the highlight end, because you can see there's a big spike there that tells me there's pretty good highlights already. So in the early days of Photoshop, a lot of people would say, always move both ends in X amount. And I would say, well, how do you know that? Because not every photograph, unless you're talking about my scanner, when we used to scan in our photographs, every single time I'd have this same problem. But with today's cameras, there's a pretty good chance overall it'll be pretty good, and you're just doing some tweaking. So if you open a photograph and you see that it's got this nice bell curve histogram that evenly goes out to both ends, then that's pretty much telling you you're at a pretty good starting point. You have to do a whole lot. Okay? So we also have down at the bottom output levels, and this I don't worry about as much as I used to. Before the internet, yes, there was a day, if you remember, where we used to do things on paper, not online all the time. I would always talk to my printer, because if I had areas on my photograph that were pure white, that meant no ink. And a printer never wants areas with absolutely no ink. They want a little tiny bit of ink so that there's full coverage on the paper. So my printer used to always tell me, change your output levels to 3 and 252. So that means at the black, it's not 100% pure black, and at white, it's not 100% pure white, but that prints better. So as a habit, every time I open a photograph for print, I would always do that. In fact, I changed my defaults to do that. Now I don't, because monitors are very different. Monitors, it's perfectly fine to have nice black and nice white point. The only thing you need to be conscious of is, am I losing detail in those areas? If they just suddenly look and there's a big white sky with nothing in it at all, that means it doesn't look as good, unless, again, we have to always measure this with a sense of, is that what I was going for, or am I okay with that? So I want to talk today about kind of guidelines of ways to make improvements, but the underlying theme is you may well have chosen that you really wanted a backlit sky that's pure white, doesn't have a lick of color in it at all. That's your choice. The histogram's going to make it look like, well, you need to adjust that dramatically, but you may choose not to. Okay? So let's talk about some of the ways, different ways we can start to make an adjustment using levels, and then we'll talk about curves, and we'll also talk about camera raw and how they all kind of mix together. So using the histogram is a great idea, but as I start to move this triangle in, I'm not exactly sure what areas. All I know is some of the dark areas are being moved to the point where there's shadows, and some areas are being ignored. So one of the things that you can do is figure out what pixel areas are really being affected as I move that triangle in. And there's a couple of ways of doing it. The quickest way is hold down Option or Alt and keep it held down. So I've got my thumb holding the Option or Alt key. As soon as I start to move in this triangle, see how the image goes completely white? Because the histogram has nothing there, that means all this part, I don't expect to see anything appear. As soon as I move a little further, then all of a sudden I'll start to see little areas appear. See how those areas are just sneaking in there? Those are telling me those are the darkest areas of the image that you're now ignoring. So, for example, in this photograph, I know that that was in the area of the tree lines, and I don't know that I really care that there's darker shadows in there. But for example, if this was a portrait of someone's face, and as you moved that, suddenly you were seeing that the first part that appeared was the whole shadow of their face, then you'd have to decide, do I really want to make that part so much of a shadow? So that's part of what this is for. What I tend to do with it is hold it down, drag it in to sort of see what it looks like, and then let go and then put it back again. So that way I can kind of see in the context of my color photograph where the areas are that I'm affecting. If I kept moving it, see how if I go even further, there's now no detail in that line of trees in the middle at all. And if I held down Option Alt, you can see that's exactly what's happening. All of those trees have no detail. So you want to be conscious of that and make decisions on a case-by-case basis to say, at what point am I okay with cutting that shadow to the point where, and sometimes, like in this case, I had to move it quite far, but I think it looks okay because the part it was affecting was small little details here and there inside the trees. And the other part of it is I'm not going to stop there and say, well, now I'm finished. That's just sort of the first step, is take a look at the shadows. You can do the same thing on the highlight end, and you can see in this photograph, as soon as I haven't even moved the triangle and I'm just holding down Option or Alt, that's telling me there's a whole bunch of the sky that's already as white as it can possibly be. So if I move that in, which I wouldn't certainly do, I'd be at the point where I'm now, in effect, blowing out the entire sky. So there's hardly any detail in the sky at all. So the histogram is still your best friend, because that's the thing that tells you, I already knew without even looking at that, using that Option Alt key, that there's that spike of information. Where this is useful is when you have a histogram where it kind of tails off at each end and you feel like you need to move each end a little bit in. Okay? So the middle triangle is the midtone information. So because I was moving that black point triangle in and I was losing some detail, I can potentially get it back if I move the midtones to the left. It's lightening up the midtone areas, which will help out the shadows a little bit. So if we look at the difference, see what it looks like there. And you can sort of see it. If you look at there's some dark areas now that weren't there before, but you can still tell they're trees. It doesn't suddenly look like just some massive color that you have no idea what it is. So my belief is that there's a lot of people that want to know every single technical aspect of functions like levels and curves and where they should click and everything else. To me, it's so dependent on your photograph that you can't lose that. You can't lose the fact that as I'm moving things, I want to stop and look at my photograph, turn it off, turn it back on again. I also have a strong belief that if you stare at anything too long, you'll just, after a while, not be able to make decisions. So I would, at a certain point, say, oh, you know what, I'm not 100% sure I know what I want to do. I'm going to save this file as a PSD file so it keeps that adjustment layer, move on to something else, and look at it 2 hours later and see if I, with fresh eyes, kind of go, oh, that actually looks okay.